This is the Open University.
Hello and welcome back to this informal university. Of course, it's time to talk about the first 5 tracks from the new album, which was going to be called Activism with a K. It's now called Acktor with a K. And I thought I would go from Quietism, the first album to come out in 2025, to activism, because that's a dialectic that we're kind of all making just now with our response to the current politics and everything. But I kind of hated the term activism because it's not sufficiently removed from the kind of directness of the clash, really, of ideologies of our time. So I thought Acktor, I cut it down to Acktor. Short is always good, but also there's a lot packed into the idea of an actor with a K. A-C-K, is an expression of frustration, so it's a bit like yikes in that sense. The yikes from last year was one of my 2 albums last year. Yikes and ballyhoo, which is going to be like yikes and tally ho. First definition, it's just the sound you make when you're ack or ach, as Germans or Scots might say. What do you do when you feel ack about something? For instance, what's happening in America? You react, you act, and you become reactive and perhaps performative. And therefore you become an actor. In a certain sense, you're performing your vulnerability and your nakedness, because act in German means nude, like in a work of art, a nude is often titled act. In hacker slang, it also means to acknowledge. A-C-K is just acknowledge. So as an actor, reacting to something performatively, you want to be acknowledged, and you feel also naked and vulnerable, perhaps. All those meanings are kind of in there, and they're kind of not at the same time. It could be empty. Of course, Acktor was the name of the first track on my last album, the first 2025 album, and that makes a little bridge to the concerns of that album. So the first thing to say about this new record is it's got no AI input at all. I'm not generating the songs with AI. I'm composing them because I don't want to give up an inch of my human capacity to compose. I wanted to try the experiment and use AI as a new color in the toolbox, a paint box rather, as I think I said last time. And it was fun for 2 albums because it kind of took me away from myself and my habits of composition. But it's really fun also to just do everything yourself. I mean, I say everything. I mean, some things are generated by loops or samples, and the old ways to kind of throw a spanner in the works usefully are still at work or at play. I guess I got a little bit scared of AI because it's no longer the glitchy and amusing, clownish AI that I was using even last year. I think it's really come to the stage now where, I was sitting in a cafe in Seoul, and I could recognize that the music they were playing was AI generated. And it was terrible. It was from Suno. I could even tell which platform was generating the music because it's got its own cliches. And it just had this awful bland sheen. But also it was quite credible that I'm sure none of the other customers in the cafe would have noticed that it was AI generated. So only because I'd actually had this experience of using Suno and Udio could I recognize it was. And that's increasingly going to be our fate as content consumers online, is not really knowing what's generated by AI and what's not. I think there should be a labeling scheme, actually. This album would proudly be labeled not AI. But also there's this question of competing incompetences. Because I think an important part of composition is the generation of accidents, happy accidents. I'm all for musically being a bit inept, therefore generating accidents by not being able to play clever things, and therefore playing stupid things were actually very touching and amazing. But also, how do you break your habits? So AI is now generating fewer accidents than it was last year, fewer glitches and fewer interesting kind of quirks, and much more glossy kind of acceptable stuff. It makes fewer mistakes, and that's a scary moment. The glitchiness is gliding away, and something too streamlined is replacing it. So what if soul lay precisely in errors, in Freudian slips, ellipses, the unconscious? And what if we had to return from recognition to cognition? Don't just recognize something that's already been a pop song, as AI tends to do. Think, cognate, what's the verb? Cogito, cogitare, I suppose in Latin. Stop delegating the building manager stuff, because, you know, I think an architect is not just like overseeing a building project. You have to really get your hands dirty with it and see how it's constructed and learn from the building blocks. So that's what I've got back to doing, back to building blocks. The first track I made for this album, I just sat down and, you know, I never have any ideas in my head for what a thing is going to be. I just sit down and find out. And that's kind of fun. So anyway, I was watching a David Bennett piano video on YouTube. He took an Adele track and he put it into other scales and modes, ironically using an AI digital audio workstation program, using an AI DAW. And I particularly like the pixie sound of the Lydian scale. I have no music theory, or very little actually myself, but I find it very interesting to discover these scales. Lydian had it's got the raised fourth note in the scale, so it was do, 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 do. A little bit magical and strange. So I made a song initially, which was just an exercise in making a Lydian melody. And I kind of wrote a scratch lyric, which was addressed to somebody called Lydia, just because it was Lydian. And she's sliding down a fire pole to the fire of me. The music had a lot of random chord and key changes going on. And the vocal melody, it was going to be placed in this kind of slightly arbitrary way, like Prefab Sprout or Steely Dan. They would sing in awkward kind of little placings of phrases that the more you listen to the song became less awkward and more kind of beautiful. So the first time you hear it like a Steely Dan song, you think, why is it phrased that way? But then you can't really imagine it any other way after a while. So I was going to turn something awkward and arbitrary into something beautiful and unpredictable. A Baroque Pearl. There were many short garage band preset synth lines and things chiming in to give it an 80s feel, and the usual kind of wobbly thing, still using this vinyl plugin which really wobbles up. It makes it sound as if the record has a pressing which is off center. And then there's a triple vocal, which is something I learned from Bowie, I guess. 3 octaves often. So after getting a mix on this track, which was funky, you know, it had that funky kind of wobbly 80s synth sound, I woke up and felt that the song, it kind of really needed a sharper lyrical theme. I didn't want to just make an ode to an imaginary firewoman called Lydia. So I quickly wrote something topical about ICE, you know, the sort of Waffen-SS, which Donald Trump has just increased the funding of from $4 billion a year to $40 billion. So this is obviously going to become his secret police and is being used to inspire fear in all his enemies.
And if we don't like the sound of anything you've said, we have the right to put you in a grim fluorescent shed.
Borders were on my mind, and they have been, I suppose, since 2016, because that is the political frontier really these days, unfortunately. Also because I just had my passport examined on a train between France and Germany, which of course is completely against the Schengen Treaty, which says that we've lifted the borders. There are no longer these customs officials and borders officials within the countries of Europe, the signatories to the Schengen Treaty. Poor old Jacques Delors and his friends, you know, they had this vision for Europe which is increasingly being whittled away and burnt away. But borders have a relationship with fear. And borders have a relationship with purity. They're kind of filtration devices for frightened people who believe that everything is toxic to them. White vulnerability, if you like. What's it? White delicacy. What's that book called? The problem is that by removing any supposed dirt with borders and with filters, we actually remove our subsistence and finally remove ourselves, or people like ourselves, and find that our lives are unsustainable. You can't purify to that extent without purifying yourself away. There are now advisories, government advisories, telling people not to visit the US because who knows if you'll be arrested and subject to extrajudicial detention. It's got very scary very quickly. I'm certainly not intending to visit the US anytime soon, especially not after making this song, but it's not the first song I've made about these developments and these personalities. It's a real contrast to back in the 90s when I would tour the US and they would give me a 1-year visa for a 2-week tour. And then when I decided to go and use that, you know, by living in New York, they gave me an O1 visa, which is the so-called genius visa, based on just one appearance on All Things Considered on NPR, which I supplied in the form of a CD. And you'd really have to think the motto now would be No Things Considered, or All Things Banned, Tariffed and Banished. It's a complete reversal of that global openness which we saw before 9/11 anyway. So the video for this song uses a 1966 BBC TV production of A. Joe, which is a Beckett play performed by one of his favourite actors, Jack McGowan. And I discovered that because I was researching a David Sylvian song called A. Joe. I'd just done a Sylvian cover, Sylvian Sakamoto's Forbidden Colours.
Learning to cope with feelings aroused in me. My hands in the soil, buried inside of myself.
He has a song called Wasn't I Joe, which I think he only does live. I'm not sure if it's recorded.
And the minutes last a lifetime.
It samples that production of that Beckett play. And I already have used Beckett TV productions in a couple of songs. Orchestras uses Ronald Pickup in Ghost Trio, and Theatre of the Self uses various actors in coloured cloaks from a piece from 1981 called Quad. Very choreographed, very much like a dance piece rather than theatre. So there's continuity in that sense. The next song, song 2, Car Crash Man, it's got a much more cheerful, uplifting kind of feeling to it. And I think the future songs I'll be writing for this album will have a bit more of that poppy quality, because I don't want to get too lugubrious and too frightened. Fear doesn't lead to good politics. So Car Crash Man started with me layering Apple loops, then adding a Hosono sample from a Miharu Koshi album he produced in 1985 called Boy Soprano. I'm a huge fan of Miharu Koshi. So although there is this non-AI policy in place for this record, one of the beats used on this track was generated last year by AI when I was still using AI. So it kind of alternates between the sample beats and then this AI beat. And lyrically, this harks back to the character I invented for this 2010 song, Mr. Consistency. And it basically shows someone blatantly contradicting thoughts with actions and thoughts with other thoughts. And that produces a kind of surrealism that's also realistic in some ways, because, you know, as Björk pointed out back in 1993, there's definitely no logic to human behavior. We are contradictory beasts. And that's, in a way, nothing to be ashamed of. We are dialectical. As soon as we're rum-tum tuggers, you know, the rum-tum tuggers got nothing on me is one of the lyrics in this song. T.S. Eliot, Practical Cats, the rum-tum tugger always wants to be in when it's out and out when it's in. And we're kind of like that because, you know, desire is based on absence and lack. And what we want is what we don't have often. So, and things we've proclaimed ourselves against are sometimes things that we suddenly want. So, I mean, that kind of explains the weirdness of today's politics as well, I think, because a lot of people are disillusioned leftists who then become rightists, and they could easily swing back. That's the nice thing. The pendulum idea is perhaps our only hope just now, which is that there are some real leftists like Momodani in New York who are coming up in strength that they never would have had before because of this pendulum, this dialectic, and this contradictoriness. But the narrator in this song, he's the car crash man. He gets into trouble. It's a bit like some of the lyrics in The Complete History of Sexual Jealousy as well, the way it repeats words with just little changes or even not changes in meaning. But the car crash man gets into trouble because of his internal contradictions, but he's like an arrogant driver. He insists he's a good driver no matter how many times he crashes or doesn't crash. So it's kind of confirmation bias, you might say. And at least he warns us, do as I don't, not as I do. The croony Anthony Newley section is something I've done a couple of times before, notably in Mr. Proctor on the Jonas album. It's, in this case, using a chopped up cover I made of Jibrayeth's song Space Clown back in 2020, and that was commissioned by a New York artist for a vinyl release that never actually happened.
You're the space clown. When you laugh, you bring the house down. When you smile, you bring the walls down. You're a space clown. 'Cause when you cry, you bring the sky down.
I chopped up the chords and kind of made it into this kind of bombastic, croony section.
I just believe in writing on dragons, which is why I strike this kangaroo.
And the narrator, the car crash man, he ends up sinking a canoe and riding a kangaroo rather than crashing cars. So we should imagine him happy, and we should probably be grateful. Definitely the happiest sounding track so far. And, you know, I'm going to try and push more in that direction, perhaps, light and happy. Although who knows how I'll feel. It's kind of rainy and grey in Berlin just now, so one doesn't feel that light and happy. The video is just me dancing around in the flat. This is the simplest video, I guess, to make. The third track was The Blonde Beast, and that's a term comes from Nietzsche, his book, The Genealogy of Morals. And in that book, he associates the blonde beast with a lion, but also with the Aryan race of Celts and Gaels, which he states were all fair-skinned and fair-haired and constituted the collective aristocracy of the time. As a Celt myself, I don't really feel very aristocratic, and I feel we're the brunt of a lot of the powerful people. For instance, being cleared out of our homelands in the Highland clearances. But for Nietzsche, we were a kind of master race. Although he also connected Japanese and Arabic nobles with this idea of the blonde beast. So it's not always blonde and blue-eyed or Aryan. But obviously this idea of the master race is a scary one that Hitler then picked up on. And Trump is now kind of covertly at the moment using. I don't think Nietzsche was a racist though, and my song is really just about success. It was only later when I Googled the phrase, because I thought that has a ring to it, and then I learned that Nietzsche had used it in this way. Actually, my song is it's more like Morrissey's We Hate It When Our Friends Become Successful, because it's about someone whose friend has made it somehow in a way that he himself hasn't. And then he's sort of saying, well, you've lost everything, you've sacrificed everything on the altar of success, this blonde beast. So it's pretty negative about the whole idea of this aristocratic alter ego that we try to become when we try to become famous. I don't need to spell out who is the world's current blonde beast. And while he may be the current poster boy for all sorts of success, it's a pretty grim prospect for the rest of us. that success is our failure, essentially, and hardly a recommendation of the whole idea of success. Musically, this one starts with a big success, Barry Manilow. And back in April, I interviewed my mother and a long video interview. She's 90 now and she lives in Edinburgh, still hale and hearty to the extent you can be at 90, and still very sharp intellectually. And she spoke about a song her second husband had sung to her about their relationship. And she remembered it as saying, "Will we last a week, a month, a year?" She didn't know who the artist was. And so I Googled this, researched this song, and the closest I could come to it was this Barry Manilow song called Forever and a Day. I'm still not sure if that was it, but because my mother didn't sing it, she just kind of quoted the lyrics. But that song impressed me. I mean, it's a kind of schmaltzy, showbizy, razzmatazzy, sentimental, but I thought I could do something with this. So when I got my hands on it, it began to become more like Bowie in his Brel phase, but it still has this kind of power because of the theatrical presentation.
I could have told them we were here to stay. To you and me forever and a day.
Could also be, a little Sondheim-y or something, but it's definitely from a sort of Broadway show kind of thing, and it'll be fun to do live because I'll be able to project it with that kind of actorish intensity.
Stuff to fake the rush that never seems enough and fades away with time. Diminishing returns, a need for self-harm as you execute the master plan.
The kind of exaggerated disgust. I don't know anybody who's become famous. I'm not particularly resentful. I don't have this ressentiment, which is another Nietzschean phrase from the Genealogy of Morals. Ressentiment to him was Christianity and socialism, movements based on resentment and weakness, a kind of institutionalized weakness in his eyes. I kind of liked the idea of, the relationship that maybe it's, I'm singing to my alter ego who's become successful. I always say that I would have become a monster if I'd really had success. It wouldn't have been good for me, for my soul, It's kind of me in a parallel world if I got successful, and me sort of waving my fist, me in this world, waving my fist at that successful Momus, if we can imagine him. And speaking of parallel worlds, the next song is called Quantum Strangeness, isn't it? And is all about parallel worlds. So it's a bit of a maudlin ballad about time, death, eternity. And it started with a 78 BPM piano figure, a little bit Carpenters-y. The lyrics based on something Einstein said in a 1955 letter about the death of his friend Michel Bessot. Now he has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That signifies nothing. For those of us who believe in physics, the distinction between past, present and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Now that was a private letter, and philosophers have debated ever since whether he really meant that time was an illusion, in other words, that time didn't exist. That idea is referred to as the block universe, and Einstein didn't believe that, we were past, present and future were simultaneous, as far as I know. But it is, in some conceptions of modern physics, quantum physics, it is conceivable that time is kind of an illusion, it does not exist. And you have the idea of the multiverse as well. Quantum computing is based on this, of course, that in sort of parallel states, you get different answers and then you choose between the answers. It implies all sorts of things that are possible in parallel worlds, and that's somewhat reassuring when you think about death. It's almost like a kind of the secular world's version of the Christian idea of an afterlife, where you have heaven, purgatory, hell, depending on which part of Christianity you follow. There could be a nightmarish take on this if the hell side of it is what appeals to you. For instance, John Robinson, who's the Momus commentator, famous Momus commentator, author of 2 books about my work, if you want to buy them, he said on Patreon, "This quantum computing parallel universes stuff is really scary. Has no one learned a lesson from the film Event Horizon? Where we're going, we won't need eyes." That's a quote from the wife of one of the characters who gouges her eyes out and says, "You won't need them, gouge your own eyes out. Follow me into hell." they're aboard an abandoned spacecraft where there's been some sort of massacre, and we don't know who's killed the people, but actually it seems like the crew has killed themselves. They were using folds in time, in other words quantum physics, as a transportation device, going through black holes and things. And it turns out that that's a kind of direct entrance to hell. The black hole is an entrance to hell. Typical Hollywood kind of negativism, negativity. I think there could be very nice parallel worlds. And in fact, the video for this, it replicates me. I kind of I used a green screen which is part of the Berlin Biennial, which I saw the other day. I saw one part of the other day, and had a huge green screen where you could appear to be walking about on the surface of Mars. So I kind of stole that, filmed myself walking about in front of that, and then dropped a new background into it of a surreal and bizarre kind of landscape of palm trees, which I'd seen in Ehime, cycling with my girlfriend in Ehime recently. Kind of beautiful but rather mournful landscape of regularly planted palm trees. And so I think that's the only song that's had any dislikes, any thumbs downs in terms of the reactions. And I kind of agree. I mean, I'm not entirely sure about the production with that Carpentersy kind of sound. It's not really as subtle musically, I think, as some of the others, but it has got this whamming kind of 1960s John Barry instrumental chorus, really, which keeps coming up. And then I kind of added these cicadas to make a direct reference to the Cabriolet song, which ends the Don't Stop the Night album, 1989. There was always something very atmospheric to me about cicadas, or semis, as they're called in Japanese. When you mix that with kind of brass instruments, and you get a sense of eternity, or perhaps a parallel eternity, and also the brevity of the life, the absurdity of the life of a cicada, which tends to live in a pupal form under the ground for 7 years or something, and then emerges and lives for just a matter of days above the surface, singing its heart out, you know, sort of making mating cries with its, rubbing its legs together and whatever they do. Deafening sound, especially in Japan, very, very loud. But yeah, a callback to 1989. And this next, the fifth out of the first 5 songs is called The Kitchen. And it began as a jam on electric piano. It's kind of a callback to 1971, a kind of reality I didn't know in 1971. But I suppose because of the current state of America, I got nostalgic. Like anyone else, I've been hugely influenced by US culture and US life. As a kind of ideal, as the soft power version of the US, which has totally been blown away now because of this hard power, nasty new face the US is presenting to the world. So I've been really delving back into, you know, weird kind of things that would reassure me that America has a nice side. It has a good soul as well as a bad soul. So I suppose the bad and illiberal America could be forgotten temporarily, and the good and liberal America could replace it. And so I hunted my memory banks for what was this good and liberal America. And one vision of it was the New York avant-garde of the 1970s and even the 80s. People like Laurie Anderson, Yvonne Rainer, Meredith Monk, Trisha Brown, Twyla Tharp, all women. So this is a female America to counterbalance against the male America, which is far too predominant currently. And contemporary dance has long been a kind of enthusiasm of mine, and I've nurtured a secret desire to become some kind of dancer, to use my body physically. A bit late now, obviously, at 65, but I used to go a lot to The Place in London, which was a dance performance venue run by John Ashford. And in the 80s, really, my favorite thing to do if I went out to a theater of some kind was to see contemporary dance. And it gave me a lot of ideas for songs, because I'd sit there, your mind is not occupied with words, you're just sort of taking in music and movement. And there's a kind of pleasant sensuality to the movement because it's about the body. And then I would just, my mind would be idling through ideas, and I'd start getting lyrical ideas for songs and things that way. I never went to The Kitchen, but there was a famous contemporary dance space, a contemporary performance art space called The Kitchen in Chelsea. But you know, I saw some of the performers, I guess, so people once they made it bigger, like Laurie Anderson, I'd see her shows like Home of the Brave or whatever, which were developments of the 70s performance art scene. But Soho, by the time I got to New York in 2000, or the late 90s anyway, was so gentrified, so thoroughly gentrified. But if you go back through the archives, and I was using ubu.com to look at the archives of the work of Gordon Matta Clark, who was an artist who set up one of the first restaurants, certainly the first artist-run cooperative restaurant in Soho in 1971, late 1971, with Carol Gooden, who was British actually, a transplant from the UK. And they, in a sense, pioneered relational aesthetics by having this restaurant where artists would come with their friends and would mix with kind of parking attendants from the neighborhood, because Soho back then was like just a junkyard of kind of rotting wrought iron buildings and car parks and kind of high crime and cheap rents and huge lofts. So people like Philip Glass were there, coming down to this restaurant, which was called Food, capital letters FOOD. One of the only places you could actually eat there, amazingly enough, one of the first arty restaurants of New York. And so that must have been an amazing scene, you know. People like Rikrik Tiravani, for instance, now, or the last 30 years or so, has been doing a similar thing, cooking for people. He really broke through doing this thing. Gordon Matta Clark died in 1978 of pancreatic cancer, unfortunately. Carol Gooden is still alive, but I wanted to celebrate their scene, so I imagined a character who's living in his loft. He's got a very cheap loft in Soho in the early 70s, and he's going every day for lunch to Food, but he's too shy to talk to the artists there, and he wants to be a dancer, but he's too shy to kind of do that at the kitchen, uptown a bit, so he just does it in his own kitchen. And to me, the song, it has this kind of dark and lonely but beautiful ambience of maybe a Scott Walker song. Like I don't compare myself to the godlike genius of Scott Walker, but it has a little bit that feel, I think. I'm always returning to like the early 70s as a kind of golden period, but it is a time when Americans were more liberal and kind-hearted. And of course, I'm sure the air pollution was terrible and there were lots of things that were worse then, but you know, it's a kind of anchor. It allows me to remember that there are still artists in the US and there are still liberal-minded people, and perhaps they will once again take the ascendant. So it's not just this personal dream of being a dancer, but also a certain image of the US as an advanced culture leading us somewhere interesting and somewhere nice. And the video I used, it's from ubu.com. They have a series called Live from Off Center, which was a mid-80s video magazine program about performing arts, and very arty and what I suppose we'd call it now pretentious, but I think it's arty in a good way, magazine program. So I had a dancer called David Parsons in the clip I used. He's sort of using a flashing light, a strobe light, dancing in a dark room, and the light catches him in various poses where he's jumping. Kind of looks like he's flying through the air, because often he's up in the air when the flash happens. And I hope you don't have epilepsy, because it might have triggered you. And also it shows Gordon Matta Clark's documentary film, Food, which he made in 1972 in his own restaurant. And that restaurant is now a branch of Marc Jacobs, wouldn't you know it. The US is now in the grip of Donald Trump, the blonde beast. We're all now forced to be reactors, activists, actors, performing our vulnerability, or our white fragility, if you like, in the drama that he's writing. Onward.
Open University.